The ruling class. Elementi di Scienza Politica. Gaetano Mosca. Translation by Hannah D. Kahn. Edited and revised, with an introduction, by Arthur Livingston. 1896. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Chapter 1. Political Science. 1. During centuries past it has many times occurred to thinkers to consider the hypothesis that the social phenomena unwinding before their gaze might not be mere products of chance, nor yet expressions of some supernatural, omnipotent will, but rather effects of constant psychological tendencies determining the behavior of the human masses. Even in Aristotle's early day an effort was made to discover the laws that govern the operation of such tendencies and their manner of functioning, and the science devoted to that purpose was called politics. During the 16th and 17th centuries many writers, particularly in Italy, applied themselves to politics. Yet they, beginning with Machiavelli, the most famous of them all, were less concerned with determining constant trends in human societies than with the arts by which an individual, or a class of individuals, might succeed in achieving supreme power in a given society and in thwarting the efforts of other individuals or groups to supplant them. Those are two different things, substantially, though there may be points of contact between them, as an analogy will serve to show. Political economy studies the constant laws or tendencies that govern the production and distribution of wealth in human societies, but that science is by no means the same as the art of amassing wealth and keeping it. A very competent economist may be incapable of making a fortune, and a banker or a businessman may acquire some understanding from knowledge of economic laws but does not need to master them, and may, in fact, get along very well in his business even in utter ignorance of them. 2. In our day the science founded by Aristotle has been subdivided and specialized, so that we have not so much a science of politics as a group of political sciences. That is not all. Efforts have been made to synthesize and coordinate the results of such sciences, and this has given rise to the science of sociology. In interpreting legislation, or otherwise commenting upon public enactments, jurists and writers on public law are almost always carried on into investigations of the general tendencies that have inspired legislation. Historians, too, in telling the story of human vicissitudes, have frequently sought to deduce from a study of historical events the laws that regulate and determine them. That was the case with Polybius and Tacitus, among the ancients, with Guicciardini in the 16th century, with Macaulay and Taine in the century just past. Philosophers, theologians, jurists, all thinkers, in short, who, directly or indirectly, have written with a view to improving human society and have, therefore, examined the laws that regulate its organization, may be considered, under one aspect or another, to have been dealing with problems of political science. It turns out that a good half of the field of human thought, an immense portion of the intellectual effort that man has devoted to delving into his past, probing his future, analyzing his own moral and social nature, may be looked upon as devoted to political science. Among the political or social sciences one branch, so far, has attained such scientific maturity that through the abundance and the accuracy of its results it has left all the others far behind. We are thinking of political economy. Toward the end of the 18th century a number of men of great ability segregated the phenomena involved in the production and distribution of wealth from the mass of other social phenomena and, considering them apart from other data, succeeded in determining many of the constant psychological laws or tendencies that they obey. This method of separating economic phenomena from other aspects of social activity, along with a habit that has grown up of considering them as independent of the other phenomena that affect the organization of political institutions, undoubtedly accounts for the rapid progress that political economy has made, but at the same time it may be held chiefly responsible for the fact that certain postulates of the science of economics are still open to controversy. If, therefore, political economy could manage to coordinate its own observations with what has been learned of other phases of human psychology, it might be able to make further and perhaps decisive progress. During the last 30 or 40 years there has been a tendency to explain all political events in human history on the basis of economic considerations. In our opinion, this point of view is too one-sided and too exclusive. There are social and political phenomena, for example, the rise and spread of the great religions, the renaissance of certain ancient nationalities, the establishment of certain powerful military monarchies, which cannot be explained solely by variations in the distribution of wealth, or by the conflict between capital and labor or between fixed and circulating capital. However, the tendencies that regulate the organization of political authority cannot be studied without taking into account the results that political economy, a sister science of more precocious growth, has already obtained. To study the tendencies mentioned is the aim of the present work. We call this study political science. We have chosen that designation because it was the first to be used in the history of human thought, because it has not yet fallen into disuse, and because the term sociology, which many writers have adopted since the day of Auguste Comte, still has no precise and sharply defined meaning. In common usage it covers all the social sciences, among them economics and criminology, rather than the science directly concerned with the study of the phenomena that are more specially and properly designated as political. 3. A science is always built up on a system of observations which have been made with particular care and by appropriate methods on a given order of phenomena, and which have been so coordinated as to disclose incontrovertible truths, which would not have been discovered by the ordinary observation of the plain man. The mathematical sciences furnish the simplest and readiest illustration of the development of the truly scientific procedure. In mathematics, the axiom is the fruit of an observation that is accessible to everybody, and its truth is apparent even to the eyes of the plain man. Stating a number of axioms and coordinating them, we get proofs for the simpler theorems. Then, still further coordinating the truths derived from such theorems with the truths of the axioms, we get proofs for new and more difficult theorems, the truth of which could be neither guessed nor proved by anyone untrained in the mathematical sciences. The procedure in physics and the other natural sciences is quite the same, but in them the method begins to be complicated by new elements. To coordinate a number of simple observations often will not suffice to provide a demonstration of a truth that we may call composite, in other words, not apparent at first glance. In the majority of cases, something corresponding to the axiom in mathematics is obtained only through experiment or prolonged observation, both of which have their value when they are conducted by special and accurate methods and by individuals who have been properly trained in such methods. In the early days of the various sciences, the sound procedure was almost always found as the result of lucky hypotheses, which were eventually substantiated by experiments and observations of fact, and which in their turn explained many other observations, many other facts. A long period of empiricism, of imperfect or erroneous methods of observation, of mistaken theories that have hampered the useful coordination of data on individual phenomena, has almost always preceded the strictly scientific period in the given science. So for many centuries astronomy and chemistry floundered about in the errors and follies of astrology and alchemy. Only after human minds had long labored over given orders of phenomena did a wealth of accumulated data, better methods, better material instruments of observation, and the insight and unflagging patience of mighty intellects finally succeed in producing those fortunate hypotheses that have made real science possible. The mere use of observation and experience within a given order of phenomena does not of itself assure truly scientific results. Francis Bacon was mistaken as to the absolute capacity of the experimental method for discovering scientific truth, and many thinkers and writers in our day are harboring the same illusion. As is well known, Bacon compared the experimental method, which for that matter had been in use long before his day, to a compass, which will allow the hand unpracticed in drawing to trace perfect circles, in other words, to obtain accurate scientific results. As a matter of fact, if observation and experience are to yield sound results, the conditions that we have specified above are essential. Ill-used, and with mistaken scientific procedures, they lead to false discoveries, or may even lend a semblance of plausibility to downright nonsense. After all, astrology and alchemy were based on observation and experience, real or presumed, but the method of observation, or rather the point of view from which observations were conducted and coordinated, was profoundly mistaken. In his Disquistiones Magicae, the notorious Martin del Bio thought that he was relying on observations of fact in drawing his distinctions between love magic, hate magic and sleep-inducing magic, and in revealing the wiles and ways of witches and sorcerers. Indeed, he intended that his observations should help people to detect witches and sorcerers and guard against them. So economists before the day of Adam Smith thought that they were resting on observations of fact when they held that the wealth of a nation lay solely in its money and in the products of its soil, and Don Ferrante, the typical scientist of the 17th century, so effectively sketched by Manzoni, was arguing from facts and experiences that were universally accepted in his time when he showed, by a reasoning which was faultlessly logical and positive as far as appearance went, that the bubonic plague could not possibly be contagious. He reasoned as follows: in rerum natura there is nothing but substance and accident. Contagion cannot be an accident because an accident cannot pass from one body to another. It cannot be a substance because substances are terreous, igneous, aqueous and aeriform. If contagion were a terreous substance, it would be visible. If aqueous, it would be wet. If igneous, it would burn. If aeriform, it would soar aloft to its proper sphere. 4. Even today political science has not yet entered upon its truly scientific period. Though a scholar may learn from it many things that escape the perception of the plain man, it does not seem to offer any body of incontrovertible truths that are accepted by all who are versed in its discipline, and much less to have acquired, so far, a trustworthy and universally accepted method of research. The causes of this situation are multiple, and for the present we cannot go into them. We may say simply that such causes are to be sought not so much in a lack of talent in the men who have pondered the subject of politics as in the great complexity of the phenomena involved in that subject and, especially, in the circumstance that, down to a few decades ago, it was virtually impossible to get accurate and complete information about the facts on which we are obliged to depend in trying to discover the constant laws or tendencies that determine the political organization of human societies. However fragmentary or defective we may consider the various methods or systems of ideas that have so far been brought to bear upon the field of political science, it is nonetheless our duty to make a rapid survey of them. Some of them have been, as they are still, little more than philosophical, theological or rational justifications of certain types of political organization which have for centuries played, and in some cases are still playing, a significant role in human history. As we shall presently see, one of the most constant of human tendencies is the tendency to justify an existing form of government by some rational theory or some supernatural belief. We have accordingly had a so-called political science at the service of societies in which belief in the supernatural still holds sway over the minds of men and in which, therefore, the exercise of political power finds its explanation in the will of God, or of the gods, and we have had, as we still have, another political science which justifies that power by representing it to be a free and spontaneous expression of the will of the people, or of the majority of the individuals composing the given society. Among all the various systems and methods of political observation, we must concern ourselves more especially with two, which are more objective and universal in character than the others and which have designedly set out to discover the laws that explain the existence of all the various forms of government that appear in the world. The first of these two methods makes the political differentiation of the various societies dependent upon variations in external environment, and more particularly in climate. The other correlates it primarily with the physical, and therefore psychological, differences between the various races of men. The first method lays primary stress on the criterion of physical environment, the other, upon the ethnological or somatic criterion. The two methods occupy such important places in the history of science and in contemporary science and are, as far as appearances go, so positive and experimental in character, that we cannot be excused from going into the matter of their actual scientific value. 5. From the days of Herodotus and Hippocrates down to the present century, an enormous number of writers have assumed that climate has an influence on social phenomena in general and on political phenomena in particular. Many have tried to demonstrate that influence and have based whole scientific systems upon it. In the forefront among these stands Montesquieu, who insists most emphatically upon the preponderant influence of climate on the moral and political systems of nations. The closer one gets to the countries of the South, he writes, the farther one seems to get from morality itself, and he declares that liberty is incompatible with warm countries and never flourishes where the orange grows. Other writers concede that civilization may have been born in the warm countries but nevertheless maintain that its center of gravity has continuously crept northward and that the countries that are best organized politically today are located in the north. Now to begin with, the climate of a country is not entirely a matter of latitude but depends also on such factors as elevation above sea level, exposure, prevailing winds, and so on. Not all of the physical environment, moreover, is dependent on climate, in other words, on variations in temperature and rainfall. Other circumstances figure in it, for example, the greater or lesser population that a region may have, and consequently the degree of development its agriculture has attained and the kind of crops that are most commonly in use. The inhabitants of a sparsely populated and therefore pastoral or wooded territory live in a physical environment that is wholly different from that of people who inhabit a densely populated and therefore intensively cultivated territory. It is undeniable, furthermore, that the influence that climate may have on the life of a people as a whole and on its political organization in particular must steadily diminish with the growth of its civilization. The vegetable kingdom is undoubtedly most at the mercy of atmospheric and telluric conditions in that plants, unless they are raised in hothouses, are almost wholly destitute of means of reaction or defense against external influences. Animals are somewhat better off, since self-defense and reaction are not altogether impossible for them. Primitive or even savage man is still better situated, for his means of defense are at least superior to those of the animals. Best situated of all is civilized man. He is so rich in resources that he feels but scant effects from changes in climate, and he is perfecting his resources and increasing their number from day to day. Granting that premise, the following conception seems to us obvious and acceptable, that the first great civilizations arose in spots where nature offered the greatest and most numerous facilities, or the fewest and least serious obstacles, that, therefore, they flourished in broad valleys that were fairly mild in climate and well enough watered to permit easy cultivation of some sort of grain. A fair density of population is a condition that is almost indispensable to the rise of a civilization. Civilization is not possible where 100 human beings are scattered over 1,000 square miles of land. But if human beings are to live in large numbers in a relatively small area, say at least 10 or 20 inhabitants per square mile, a grain culture is essential. In fact, we find that the rise of Chinese civilization was contemporaneous with, or subsequent to, the cultivation of rice. The Egyptian and Mesopotamian civilizations were based on wheat, barley and millet, and the Aboriginal American civilizations on maize. In a few tropical countries certain fruits, such as the banana, or farinaceous roots such as manioc, may have taken the place of cereals. This induction is corroborated by history, which shows early civilizations in the valleys of the Nile, the Euphrates, the Ganges, and the Yellow River, and on the Anahuac Plateau, lands which present all the physical conditions that we have mentioned. But once man has succeeded in so marshalling his forces as to tame nature in some exceptionally favorable spot, he can go on to master her in other places where she is more recalcitrant. In our day, with the exception of the polar regions, a few spots, possibly, about the equator, and certain areas where excessive aridness or the presence of malaria creates peculiarly unfavorable conditions, all the lands of the earth are, or can be made, capable of harboring civilized populations. 6. The principle that civilization always spreads from south to north, or rather from warm to cold areas, we regard as one of those oversimple formulas which attempt to explain extremely complicated phenomena by a single cause. It is based on a mere fragment of history, on the history of a single period in European civilization, and a history superficially studied at that. If one were to use this method in examining a map of northern Germany, or of Siberia, let us say, one might deduce a law that all rivers flow from south to north, because that is true of those countries, which have highlands in the south and seas to the north. The rule might be reversed if one were studying southern Russia, while South America might furnish still a third law, namely, that rivers flow from west to east. The truth is that, with no reference whatever to latitude or longitude, rivers flow from high to low, from mountains or plateaus to seas or lakes. If one were to call lands offering the lesser resistance lower lands, one might say that the law that governs the expansion of civilization is the very same. The civilizing current flows indifferently from south to north and from north to south, but it flows by preference in the direction in which it encounters the least natural and social resistance, and by social resistance we mean the impact of other original civilizations developing in inverse directions. Chinese civilization arose in the central provinces of the empire. It was shut in on the north by the barren and frigid plateaus of Central Asia, while on the south it could flow not only into the southern provinces of China proper but into Indochina as well. Hindu civilization, encountering the almost insurmountable chain of the Himalayas on the north, pressed from north to south, from northern India into the Deccan, and thence on to Ceylon and Java. Egyptian civilization crept northward until it met the powerful confederation of the Hittites, in other words the impact of another civilization, in northern Syria. On the other hand, it was in a position to expand more extensively to the south, and it in fact ascended the Nile from Memphis to Thebes and from Thebes to Meroe. It now seems certain that the earliest dynasties flourished at Tanis and Memphis, that Thebes came into prominence only after the invasion of the Shepherd Kings, and that Ethiopia was civilized by the Egyptians and did not become an independent realm until a very late date. Heir to the ancient cultures of Mesopotamia, Persian civilization spread from east to west, in the direction in which it encountered fewest natural obstacles, until it collided with Greek civilization. Greco-Roman civilization embraced the whole basin of the Mediterranean. Arrested to the south by impassable deserts and toward the east by Oriental civilization in the form of the Parthian Empire and then of the Persian, it spread northward until it came to the swamps and forests, at the time almost impassable, of northern Germany and Scotland. Mohammedan civilization was barred on the south by sea and desert and so was impelled towards the northwest. During the Middle Ages, European civilization was checked on the south by Arab civilization, which wrested the entire southern portion of the Mediterranean basin from it. It moved northward, accordingly, absorbing Scotland, northern Germany, Scandinavia, and Poland. Today the civilization of Europe is stretching out in all directions, wherever there are sparsely populated lands that are easy to colonize, or decadent nations that are waiting for a conqueror. The center of a civilization, as the latter flows in one direction or another, seems to move in conformity with the law we have just stated. The countries that lie on the frontiers of a type of human civilization are not as a rule the ones that are most advanced in it. When European civilization embraced the whole Mediterranean basin, Greece proper and southern Italy were the hub of the civilized world, and they were the most vigorous, the most cultured, the most prosperous countries in it. When they became the most advanced outposts of civilization facing the Mohammedan world, they declined. In a given country, conditions being equal, the most civilized and prosperous district seems almost always to be the one that has the readiest means of communication with the lands that constitute the hearth, or radiation center, of the civilization to which the country itself belongs. As long as Sicily was part of the Hellenic world, which had its center to the east of Sicily, the most prosperous and highly civilized section of the island was the east coast. During the Arab period, western Sicily was the most cultured, prosperous and thickly populated, being closest to Africa, whence Mohammedan civilization was radiating. Today the greatest population and wealth are concentrated on the north coast of the island, facing northern Europe. 7. It is also, in our opinion, a very rash hypothesis to ascribe a superior morality to the peoples of the north as compared with the peoples of the south. Morality results from such complex qualities of mind and spirit, and the external circumstances within which human life unfolds play such a large part in positive or negative expressions of morality, that to determine whether a single individual is potentially more moral than another is in itself not a little difficult. Difficult indeed is that same judgment with respect to two societies, two human masses composed of many individuals. Statistical data on this subject cannot tell everything, often they fail even to tell enough. Personal impressions are almost always too subjective, on the whole they are less trustworthy than statistics. Generally speaking, it is the unfamiliar form of immorality that makes the greater impression, and so we are prone to judge people of another country as worse than people of our own. Moreover, we are commonly given to considering as less moral than others the country in which we came first or most thoroughly to know and appraise certain vices and frailties which, really, are common to all men. The vice most commonly attributed to Southerners is lust, whereas Northerners are more generally charged with drunkenness. And yet it may be observed that Congo Negroes become more disgracefully drunk than Russian peasants or Swedish laborers, and as for lust, it appears that folkways and the type of social organization that each people creates for itself as the result of a sequence of historical circumstances exert a profounder influence upon it than does climate. Before his conversion to Christianity, Saint Vladimir, the Tsar who was canonized and became the patron saint of all the Russias, had more women in his harem than the Caliph Harun al-Rashid overdid. Ivan the Terrible emulated and outstripped in cruelty and lust Nero, Heliogabalus and the bloodiest sultans of the East. In our day there is perhaps more prostitution in London, Paris and Vienna than there ever was in ancient Babylon and Delhi. In present-day Europe, Germany leads in the number of sex crimes, and then follow, in descending order, Belgium, France, Austria, and Hungary. Italy stands near the bottom of the list, and Spain comes last of all. Many criminologists assume a predominance of crimes of violence, or offenses against the person, in the South, whereas they credit the North with a larger quota of offenses against property. But Tarde and Kulahani have shown conclusively that such relations that have been sought between climate and type of crime are rather to be ascribed to differences in social conditions such as may be encountered in various districts in a given country. It is true that in the United States, France and Italy crimes of violence regularly prevail in the South, while the northern darts of those countries show a relatively higher frequency of crimes against property. But as Tarde himself well points out, in all those countries the southern districts are poorer in facilities of communication, are farther removed from the great industrial cities and from the centers of present-day civilization, than are the northern regions, and it is to be expected that violent forms of crime should predominate, irrespective of climate, in less advanced regions, and that crimes requiring skill and shrewdness should be more common in better educated ones. This, in fact, would seem to be the most adequate explanation of the phenomenon. The French departments that show the highest figures for crimes of violence, Ardea and Lozier, in the eastern Pyrenees, lie, to be sure, in the south of France, but they are relatively cold regions because of the mountainous nature of the country. In Italy the Basilicata furnishes one of the highest percentages of crimes of violence, but it is a mountainous district and relatively cold. The peaks of the Mates, the Gargano and the Sila are snow-covered for most of the year, as are the highlands that bear certain Sicilian towns notorious for enterprises involving blood and brigandage. 8. Going on to the strictly political aspect of the question, we may note that before we can decide whether Southerners are unfitted for liberty we must come to an understanding as to the exact meaning of the term liberty. If we assume that the freest country is the country where the rights of the governed are best protected against arbitrary caprice and tyranny on the part of rulers, we must agree that political institutions that are regarded as superior from that point of view have flourished both in cold countries and in very temperate countries, such as Greece and Rome. Vice versa, systems of government based on the arbitrary will of rulers may be found in such very cold countries as Russia. The constitutional form of government had no more vigorous beginnings in foggy England than it had in Aragon, Bastille, and Sicily. If Montesquieu had extended his travels a little farther south, he would have found, in Sicily, a political order under which, even in his day, the royal authority was much more limited than it was in France. Granting that in our time the various representative systems may be regarded as the least imperfect forms of government, we find them in force in northern and southern Europe equally, and, outside of Europe, they probably function as well in chilly Canada as they do at the Cape of Good Hope, where the climate, if not actually hot, is certainly very mild. The reason why Southerners should be less well fitted for free and enlightened forms of government can only be this, that they are possessed of less physical, and especially less moral and intellectual vitality. It is, in fact, very commonly believed that in view of a superior energy, which expresses itself in industriousness, in war, in learning, Northerners are destined always to be conquerors of the ineffectual Southerners. But that view is even more superficial and contrary to fact than the ones we have just refuted. Actually, civilizations which arose and developed in hot or very mild climates have left behind them monuments that attest an advanced culture and an untold capacity for labor, which are all the more astonishing in that the peoples in question did not have at their disposal the machines that today multiply man's resources 100-fold. The capacity of a people for hard work seems to depend not so much on climate as on habits that are in large part determined by the vicissitudes of its history. In general, habits of application and industry are shown by peoples of very ancient civilization who have long since attained the agricultural level and have, moreover, long enjoyed tolerable political systems that assure the working man of at least some fraction of the fruits of his toil. On the other hand, peoples that have relapsed into a partial barbarism, or barbarous and semi-barbarous peoples that are accustomed to live to some extent by war and thieving, are usually indolent and sluggish apart from activities relating to fighting or hunting. In just such terms did Tacitus describe the ancient Germans. In our time the North American Indians and the Kalmucks of Asia are exceedingly lazy, though the former once lived, as the latter still live, in very cold countries. The Chinese of the southern provinces are a hard-working people, and the Egyptian fellah can toil with the utmost endurance. The absence of large-scale industry in the southernmost parts of Europe has created and continues to sustain the impression that their inhabitants are indolent workers, but anyone who knows these peoples well knows how little, on the whole, that reputation is deserved. Sicily may be taken as an example. That island, with an area of about 20,000 square miles, supports a population of over 4 million, in other words, about 180 people per square mile. There are no large industries and no great abundance of capital. The soil, largely mountainous, is rich in sunshine but poor in water. If a population is to live with any degree of comfort at all under such conditions, the soil must be tilled with untiring effort and with a certain amount of technical proficiency. If we assume that military superiority is a test of greater energy, it is hard indeed to decide whether Northerners have defeated and conquered Southerners more often than Southerners have defeated and conquered Northerners. The Egyptians were Southerners, and in their heyday they swept in triumph over Asia as far as the mountains of Armenia. The Assyrian warriors lived in the mildest of climates, yet, however much we may deplore their brutality, we cannot but marvel at their indomitable energy in war. The Greeks were Southerners, but they managed to conquer all Western Asia, and by force of arms, colonization, commerce and intellectual superiority they Hellenized the entire eastern portion of the Mediterranean basin and a considerable part of the basin of the Black Sea. The Romans, too, were Southerners, and their legions overran the plains of Dacia, penetrated the inaccessible forests of Germany, and pursued the Piets and Caledonians into the deepest recesses of their bleak, wild mountains. The Italians of the Middle Ages were Southerners, and they wrought miracles in war, industry and commerce. Southerners, too, were the Spaniards of the 16th century, those glamorous conquistadors who in less than half a century explored, overran and conquered most of the Americas. The Franco-Norman followers of William the Conqueror were Southerners, as compared with the English, yet in a few years' time they were able almost entirely to dispossess the inhabitants of southern Great Britain and to drive the Angles, at the point of the sword, back to the old Roman wall. The Arabs were Southerners in an absolute sense, yet in less than a century they imposed their conquest, and with their conquest their language, their religion and their civilization, upon as generous a portion of the world as the modern Anglo-Saxons have conquered and colonized in the course of many centuries. 9. Differences in social organization depending on land configuration or topography may be considered as secondary to those due to variations in climate, though they may perhaps be more important. Whether a country is more or less level or more or less mountainous, whether it is situated on the great highways of communication or remote from them, are factors that exert a far greater influence on its history than a few degrees more or less of mean temperature. The importance of such factors must not be exaggerated, however, to the point of making an inexorable law of them. Topographical features that are favorable under certain historical conditions may become very unfavorable under others, and vice versa. When all Europe was still in the Bronze and the early Iron Age, Greece found herself in an amazingly favorable situation for achieving leadership in her corner of the world, since she was better placed than any other country for absorbing infiltrations from Egyptian and Asiatic civilizations. But in modern times, down to the cutting of the Isthmus of Suez, Greece was one of the least favorably situated of the countries of Europe, since she lay remote from the center of European culture and from the great highways of transatlantic and East Indian commerce. Another widespread opinion in such matters is that mountaineers are usually superior to lowlanders and are destined almost always to conquer them. Certainly more can be said for that theory than for the ascription of marked superiority to peoples of the north. It may be questionable whether a cold climate is more salubrious than a temperate or warm climate, but it seems to be established that highlands are almost always more healthful than lowlands, and better health implies stronger physical constitution and therefore greater energy. But great energy is not always combined with strength of social structure, upon which, after all, decision as to whether a people is to rule or to be ruled depends. Now a sound political organism that unites and directs the energies of great masses of people arises and maintains itself more readily on plains than in mountainous countries. In fact, we see, in Turkey and the Near East, that though the Circassian, Kurdish and Albanian mountaineers have frequently attained importance as individuals, and though bands of them in the service of bordering countries have often become forces to be reckoned with and feared, yet Albania, Circassia and Kurdistan have never, in historic times, become nuclei of great independent empires. On the contrary, they have always been drawn into the orbits of the great political organisms that touch their borders. The Swiss, too, have had great importance as individuals and as corps of mercenaries, but Switzerland as a nation has never weighed perceptibly in the political scales of Europe. History shows, in general, that if intrepid bands of mountaineers have often devastated, rather than conquered, lowlands, still more often have the organized armies of lowlanders crushed the disconnected efforts of highlanders and reduced them to permanent submission. The Romans conquered the Samnites, while the Samnites were able to defeat the Romans only in an occasional battle. Bands of the Scottish Highlanders did now and then overrun northern England and ravage it, but the lowland English more often defeated mountainous Scotland and ended by conquering it, taming its warlike impulses and assimilating it completely. For that matter, lowland peoples are not necessarily destitute of energy, or even poorly endowed with it. One has only to think of the Dutch, the North Germans, the Russians, the English, who are in large part inhabitants of very low countries. 10. The method that ascribes the degree of progress and civilization that a nation has attained and the type of political organization that it has adopted to the race to which it belongs is much less ancient than the method which views climate as the arbiter of everything. That could hardly be otherwise. Anthropology and comparative philology, upon which the scientific classification of the races of mankind is based, are very recent sciences. Broca and Grimm lived in the 19th century, whereas approximative information as to climatic differences was available in the early day of Herodotus. However, newcomer as it may have been, the ethnological trend in the social sciences has been correspondingly aggressive, and the last decades of the 19th century witnessed an attempt to interpret all human history on the basis of racial differences and racial influences. A distinction was drawn between superior races and inferior races, the former being credited with civilization, morality and a capacity for organizing themselves into great political units, while for the latter was reserved the harsh but inevitable lot either of vanishing before the encroachment of the higher races or of being conquered and civilized by them. At the most it was granted that they might go on living in independence, but without ever attaining the degree of culture and the flawless social and political organization that were proper to peoples of the privileged stocks. Renan wrote that spiritual poetry, faith, liberty, honor, self-sacrifice appeared in the world only with the advent of the two great races which, in a sense, had fashioned humanity, the Aryan and the Semitic. For Gobineau, the central point of history is always located where the purest, strongest, most intelligent white group abides. Lapouche pushes the same doctrine to its extremest consequences. In his opinion, not only is the race that is truly moral, truly superior in all things, the Aryan, but within the Aryan race itself those individuals excel who have kept the Aryan type in pure and uncontaminated forms, those who are tall, blond and dolichocephalic. Yet even among the nations that pass as Indo-Germanic, individuals of this type constitute only a small minority scattered about among a short, dark, brachycephalic majority. The true Aryans, therefore, are fairly numerous in England and North America. They begin to dwindle in numbers in Germany, being encountered there only in the upper classes. They are very rare in France and become a virtually unknown commodity in the countries of southern Europe. Morcelli espouses Lapouche's thesis, maintaining the superiority of blonde strains over dark, because the most highly civilized nations are those in which blondes prevail in numbers, and within any given country the most highly civilized region or province is always the one where blondes are most numerous. Along with this school which maintains the innate and inevitable superiority of certain races, there is another, which, without being in absolute opposition to it, is more directly linked with Darwin's theories, so widely applied to the social sciences during the second half of the past century. Spencer is the best-known writer of this second school, which has many followers. Without maintaining the inevitable and unbroken superiority of any one race over others, these scholars believe that all social progress has come about, and is still being made, by a process of organic, or superorganic, evolution, so-called. A continuous struggle, the struggle for existence, is always going on within every society. As a result, the stronger and better individuals, those who are best adapted to their environment, survive the weaker and less well adapted and propagate their kind in preference to the latter, passing on to their descendants as an inborn heritage the qualities, acquired by a slow process of education, which won them their victory. The same struggle goes on between societies themselves, and by it the more soundly constituted societies, those composed of the stronger individuals, conquer societies that are less advantageously endowed. The latter, driven to territories less favorable to human progress, are condemned to remain in a state of everlasting inferiority. It is not hard to find a fundamental difference between these two theories. Even if the monogenistic theory, that all the races of mankind derive from a common stock, be granted, the fact still remains that differentiating traits are certainly very ancient and must have been fixed in ages extremely remote, when man had not yet emerged from his savage stage and was therefore more prone to feel the influence of the natural agencies with which he came into contact. The Aboriginal American race had the physical traits it now has in a fairly remote prehistoric epoch. In very ancient Egyptian bas-reliefs, which go back some 20 centuries before our era, figures of Negroes, Semites and native Egyptians show the physical characteristics that still distinguish them. Keeping to the strictly ethnological theory, therefore, the higher races must already have possessed their traits of superiority at the dawn of history and have retained them practically unaltered, whereas the evolutionary theory proper implicitly or explicitly assumes that the struggle for existence has had its practical effects more recently. To that struggle it ascribes the rise and fall of the various nations and civilizations during the historic period. 11. Before the question of racial superiority or inferiority can be considered, the value of the word race has to be determined, for it is used sometimes in a very broad, sometimes in a very narrow, sense. We speak of white, yellow and black races to designate varieties of the human species that not only differ in language but present fairly important and fairly palpable anatomical differences. We speak of the Aryan and the Semitic races to indicate two subdivisions of the white race, which differ, to be sure, in language, but which present very striking physical resemblances. We also say the Latin, the Germanic, the Slavic races, designating by the same term three subdivisions of the Aryan branch of the white race. Though these races speak different languages, it can nevertheless be proved, philologically, that they are bound together by a common origin, while their physical differences are so slight that a member of one group can be mistaken for a member of another. Now in this case, as in all others, confusion in terminology leads to confusion in ideas. The fact of racial difference is pressed into service as much to explain certain diversities in civilization and political organization between whites and Negroes as to account for similar diversities between Latins, Germans, and Slavs, whereas in the first case the ethnological coefficient may have a real significance and in the second, hardly any at all. We must also bear in mind that in historic and prehistoric times race crossings and mixtures, particularly between closely related races, were frequent. In the latter case, since the physical differences between the crossed races are of scant importance, and not readily perceptible in any event, classification has been based upon philological affinities rather than upon anatomical traits. The language criterion is anything but trustworthy and infallible. It may happen, and frequently does happen, that two groups which are closely related by blood speak languages that have only remote philological kinship, while peoples of different races may speak languages and dialects that are closely affiliated as to word roots and grammatical structure. However dubious that statement may seem at first glance, there are many examples that prove it and many historical situations that explain it. In general, conquered peoples who are less civilized than their conquerors adopt the laws, arts, culture and religion of the latter and often end by adopting their language. The languages and civilizations of the Greeks and Romans enjoyed a marvelous expansion through their adoption by barbarous peoples. In France, the substratum of the population is still Cimbro-Celtic, but French is essentially a Neo-Latin language. In Spain, Basque blood probably predominates in the north. In the south, the admixture of Arabo-Berber blood must be very strong. In Italy, there are appreciable ethnic differences between Italians of the north and Italians of the south in the islands, but the various dialects are all essentially Neo-Latin. Leaving the sphere of Latin, we find that the Fellahs, who are descendants of the ancient Egyptians, have forgotten the ancient tongue of Mizraim and adopted Arabic, which, moreover, has become general throughout Iraq, Arabia and Syria, and is becoming more and more the spoken language of the African Berbers. As for India, dialects of Sanskrit origin are spoken by populations which in skin color and facial features show a strong admixture, and perhaps even a predominance, of Dravidic blood. In Silesia, Brandenburg, Pomerania and Old Prussia, German is the language of populations that were partly Slavic or partly Lettish in origin. In our own day, finally, the Celts of Ireland and northern Scotland are adopting English more and more. These considerations are self-evident, yet people continue to make ethnographic classifications, especially of European peoples, with sole reference to philological criteria. To tell the truth, it may be said in defense of this system that similarity of language, engendering as it does a freer interchange of ideas and feelings between certain peoples, tends to give them a far stronger resemblance in intellectual and moral type than customarily results from mere blood relationship. Bearing all this in mind, it seems to us an established fact that the most primitive races, those which anthropologists call lower the Fuegians, the Australians, the Bushmen, and so on, are physically and intellectually inferior to the others. Whether that inferiority is innate, whether it has always existed, or whether it is to be attributed to the barrenness of their habitats, to the meagerness of the resources that their surroundings offer and to the abject poverty resulting, is a question that it is neither easy nor essential for us to answer. After all, these races represent only a very minute fraction of mankind, and that fraction is rapidly dwindling before the expansion of the white race, which is being followed in its turn, in many places, by an infiltration from the yellow race. In strict justice, we are obliged to recognize that the prosperity of the white and yellow races in localities where the Aborigines barely managed to subsist has not been wholly due to the organic superiority which the former boastfully claim. The newcomers bring with them knowledge and material means which enable them to reap an ample livelihood from soils that of themselves would yield practically nothing. The Australian native for centuries upon centuries was content to track the kangaroo, bring down birds with his boomerang or, if worse came to worst, catch a lizard. But we must remember that he had no means of securing the seeds to grow grains or other edible plants, or the breeders for flocks of sheep, which the English colonists had at their disposal. It is still harder to come to any decision as to the inferiority of the Native American and the black races. Those races have from time immemorial held possession of far-flung territories in which powerful civilizations might have developed. In America, populous empires arose in Mexico, Peru and a few other regions. We cannot determine the degree of their culture with any exactness, since it was their misfortune to crumble before the onslaught of a few hundred Spanish adventurers. In Africa, the blacks have managed to organize fairly extensive political units at one time or another, for example, in Uganda, but not one among such states ever attained by itself a degree of culture that could be compared with that of the most ancient empires founded by the white races, or of the Chinese, Babylonian and ancient Egyptian empires, where the civilizing races were not black. It would seem, accordingly, that a certain inferiority might also be attributed prima facie to both the American Indians and the Negroes. But when things have gone in a certain way, it is not always legitimate to assume that they necessarily and unfailingly had to go that way. It is doubtful whether man existed in the Tertiary period, but it has been scientifically proved that his antiquity goes back to the beginnings of the Quaternary period and that the age of man therefore has to be computed not in thousands of years but in hundreds and perhaps thousands of centuries. Now the races of man, as we noted above, must have been formed at a very remote epoch, and since such long periods are involved, the fact that a race has attained a notable degree of culture 30, 40, even 50 centuries before another is not an infallible proof of its organic superiority. External circumstances, often fortuitous, the discovery and utilization of a metal, which may happen more or less easily according to the region, the availability or absence of domesticable plants or animals, may accelerate or retard the progress of a civilization, or even alter its history. If the American Indians had known the use of iron, a hypothesis that is not in the least far-fetched, since they did no other metals, such as gold and copper, or if the Europeans had invented gunpowder 2 centuries later than they did, the Europeans would not so swiftly or so completely have destroyed the political organizations of the Indians. Nor should we forget that if a race that has attained a ripe civilization, on coming into contact with another race that is still in a state of barbarism, contributes to the latter a store of useful tools and knowledge, it nevertheless profoundly disturbs, if it does not altogether arrest, the spontaneous and original development of the primitive society. Not only, in fact, have the whites almost everywhere wiped out or subjugated the American Indians. For centuries and centuries, now with alcohol, now with the slave trade, they have brutalized and impoverished the Negro race. We are obliged to agree, therefore, that European civilization has not only hindered but actually thwarted any effort toward progress that Negroes and Indians might have made of their own accord. At various branches of the American Indian race, as well as at the Polynesians, the Australians and others of the less fortunate races of human beings, the charge has been leveled that they cannot survive contact with the white man but vanish rapidly before his advance. The truth is that the whites deprive the colored races of their means of livelihood before those races have time to accustom themselves to utilizing the new means of subsistence that are introduced by the whites. As a rule, the hunting territories of the primitive tribes are invaded and the big game destroyed before the native can adapt himself to agriculture. Moreover, the civilized races communicate their diseases to the less civilized, while the latter are unable to take advantage of the preventive or curative measures that scientific progress and long experience have taught to the whites. Tuberculosis, syphilis and smallpox would probably wreak as great havoc among us as they have wrought in certain primitive tribes if we tried to forestall and cure them exclusively with the means that the savages have at their disposal, no means at all, in other words. Are Indians and Negroes on the whole inferior to whites as individuals? While most people would answer with a ready and emphatic yes, some few with equal promptness and resolve say no. As for us, we find it as hard to agree as to disagree in terms at all positive. Observers rarely fail to report, in strictly primitive groups of these races, individuals who are outstanding for qualities, now of mind, now of heart. Where the American Aborigines have mingled with the whites and adopted their civilization, they have not failed to produce distinguished men in nearly all branches of human activity, and under identical conditions the Negroes can boast of a list of names almost as long. Nevertheless, one has to admit, as regards both these races, that the roster of conspicuous individuals is very brief as compared with the number of individuals who have been, and are, in a position to enjoy the advantages offered by civilized life. Some weight, however, has to be given to a remark that was made to Henry George by a scholarly Negro bishop, that Negro school children do as well as white children and show themselves just as wide awake and intelligent up to the age of 10 or 12, but as soon as they begin to realize that they belong to a race that is adjudged inferior, and that they can look forward to no better lot than that of cooks and porters, they lose interest in studying and lapse into apathy. In a great part of America, colored people are generally regarded as inferior creatures, who must inevitably be relegated to the lowest social strata. Now, if the disinherited classes among the whites bore on their faces the indelible stamp of social inferiority, it is certain that few individuals indeed among them would have the energy to raise themselves to a social position very much higher than the one to which they were born. If some doubt may be raised as to the aptitude of Negroes and American Indians for the higher forms of civilization and political organization, all perplexity vanishes as regards the Aryans and the Semites, the Mongolian, or yellow, race and the dark Asiatic race which lives mixed with the Aryan stock in India and has fused with the yellow in southern China, in Indochina and perhaps in Japan. These races taken together make up more than 3/4, and perhaps as much as 4/5, of all mankind. We say nothing of the Polynesian race. It may well have superior capacities, but being scant in numbers and dispersed over small islands, it has not been able to create any great civilization. The Chinese succeeded in founding a highly original civilization which has shown wondrous powers of survival and even more wondrous powers of expansion. Offshoots in large part of Chinese civilization are the cultures of Japan and Indochina, and the Sumerian people which founded the earliest civilization in Babylonia seems to have belonged to a Turanian stock. The dark Asiatic race seems to have developed a very ancient civilization in Elam, or Susiana, and an autochthonous culture apparently existed in India before the coining of the Aryans. Egypt owes her civilization to a so-called sub-Semitic or Berber race, and Nineveh, Sidon, Jerusalem, Damascus and perhaps even Sardis belong to the Semites. Reference to the more recent civilization of the Mohammedan Arabs seems to us superfluous. 12. While not holding to the absolute superiority or inferiority of any human race, many people believe that each race has special intellectual and moral qualities and that these necessarily correspond to certain types of social and political organization, from which the spirit, or, better, the peculiar genius of the race, will not permit it to depart. Now, making all due allowances for the exaggerations that gain ready admission to discussions of this subject, and taking account at all times of the great fund of human traits that is present in all peoples in all ages, it cannot be denied that, not to say every race, every nation, every region, every city presents a certain special type that is not uniformly definite and clear-cut everywhere, but which consists in a body of ideas, beliefs, opinions, sentiments, customs and prejudices, which are to each group of human beings what the lineaments of the face are to each individual. This variation in type could safely be regarded as due to physical diversities, to racial variations, to the different blood that flows in the veins of each different nationality, did it not find its explanation in another fact, which is one of the best authenticated and most constant that observation of human nature affords. We refer to mimetism, to that great psychological force whereby every individual is wont to adopt the ideas, the beliefs, the sentiments that are most current in the environment in which he has grown up. Save for rare and rarely complete exceptions, a person thinks, judges and believes the way the society in which he lives thinks, judges and believes. We observe that aspect of things which is commonly noted by the persons about us, and the individual preferably develops those moral and intellectual attitudes which are most prevalent and most highly esteemed in the human environment in which he has been formed. In fact, unity of moral and intellectual type is found to be very strong in groups of persons having nothing special in common as regards blood or race. The Catholic clergy will serve as an example. Scattered the world over, it always preserves a singular uniformity in its beliefs, its intellectual and moral attitudes and its customs. The phenomenon is most striking in the various religious orders. Well known is the remarkable resemblance of an Italian Jesuit to a French, German or English Jesuit. A strong resemblance exists, too, in the military type that is common to almost all the great European armies, and a fairly constant intellectual or moral type may further exist within separate regiments, in military academies and even in secular schools, anywhere, in short, where a special environment has somehow been established, a sort of psychological mold that shapes to its own contour any individual who happens to be cast into it. We are not for the moment inquiring as to how the great national environments, and better still those great psychological currents that sometimes embrace a whole civilization or all the followers of a religion, have come into being, lived their lives and, often, vanished from the world scene. To launch out on such a study would involve retraversing the history of the whole civilized portion of mankind. But this much we can safely say, that historical circumstances peculiar to each of the great groups of mankind have in the main fashioned the special environments mentioned, and that new historical circumstances slowly modify, or even destroy, those environments. The role that blood relationship, that race, plays in the formation of the various moral and mental environments may, in certain cases at least, be slight and of difficult appraisal even when the ethnological factor seems at first glance to be preponderant. After this point would be the example of the Jews, who have been dispersed among other peoples yet for centuries upon centuries have wondrously preserved their national type. But we must not forget, either, that the children of Israel have always lived spiritually apart from the peoples among whom they dwelt, and therefore have always been in a special environment. As Leroy Bewley well says, the modern Jew is a product of the isolation in which he has for centuries been kept by the Torah, the Talmud and the ghetto. The progeny of Jewish families that are converted to Christianity or to Islamism rarely retain the characteristics of their ancestors for any length of time, for many generations, that is, and the unconverted Jew best preserves his special type in countries where he keeps most to himself. A Jew from Little Russia or Constantinople is much more Jewish than his coreligionists who have been born and bred in Italy or France, where the ghetto is now just a memory. Chinese immigrants in America take over white civilization in many respects, but their mental type remains unchanged, while the Chinese in California and some other states always keep to themselves in a Chinese environment. In European and Asiatic Turkey, Turks, Greeks, Armenians, Jews and Levantines live together in the same cities. They do not fuse nor are their races modified, for in spite of the fact that they live in material contact, they are spiritually separated, each group having its own special environment. The great tenacity with which the English national type maintains itself, as compared with other nationalities of Europe, may be the result of the scant sociability that English settlers in foreign countries manifest toward natives, which inclines them to cluster together in a miniature British environment. Many cases might be mentioned where ethnic affinity between two peoples is a virtually negligible bond as compared with the ties that result from similarities in religion or from the fact of common histories and civilizations. Ethnologists have discovered that a Magyar is more closely related to a Chinese or a Turk than to a Frenchman or a German. But who would claim that he is morally and intellectually closer to the two former than to the two latter? The Mohammedan Aryans of Persia and Hindustan certainly have closer moral affinities with the Arabs and Turks than with their European kinsmen, and Jews long settled in Western Europe certainly feel spiritually closer to the nations among whom they live than to the Arabs, who are blood relatives but who have adopted Oriental civilization. The so-called genius of a race, therefore, has nothing predestined or inevitable about it, as some people are pleased to imagine. Even granting that the various higher races, in other words races that are capable of creating original civilizations of their own, differ organically from each other, it is not the sum of their organic differences that has exclusively or even principally determined the differences in the social type that they have adopted, but rather the differences in social contacts and in the historical circumstances to which every nation, every social organism, let alone every race, is fated to be subject. 13. The question of race would at this point be settled if everyone were in agreement that the organic and psychological changes by which a human race may be modified over an extensive period of history, for example, 20 or 30 centuries, are hardly appreciable and virtually negligible. But this is far from being a generally accepted belief. There is, in fact, a whole school of historical thinking that is founded on quite different postulates. Applying Darwin's doctrines about the evolution of species to the social sciences, this school holds that every human group can make considerable organic improvements in relatively brief periods of time, whence the possibility of political and social betterment. Now, without discussing or denying Darwin's theories about the transformation of species, and even granting man's descent from a hypothetical Anthropopithecus, one fact seems to us certain, undebatable and obvious at first glance, that the famous struggle for existence, along with the natural selection that follows from it, as described for plants, animals and savage man, does not appear in human societies that have attained anything higher than a very elementary stage of civilization. The eagerness to find such a struggle in human societies is in part due to the extraordinary success of the Darwinian hypothesis when applied to the natural sciences. That success was bound to offer a strong temptation to systematic minds to extend the application of the hypothesis to other fields. But it is also due to a misapprehension, to a failure to distinguish between two facts that are basically different though apparently they have points of contact, and this confusion, too, is readily understandable in minds that are strongly predisposed in favor of the evolutionary theory. To put the situation in a few words, the struggle for existence has been confused with the struggle for preeminence, which is really a constant phenomenon that arises in all human societies, from the most highly civilized down to such as have barely issued from savagery. In a struggle between two human societies, the victorious society as a rule fails to annihilate the vanquished society, but subjects it, assimilates it, imposes its own type of civilization upon it. In our day in Europe and America, war has no other result than political hegemony for the nation that proves superior in a military sense, or perhaps the seizure of some bit of territory. But even in ancient times, when Greece was fighting Persia and Rome Carthage, the political organization, the national existence, of the vanquished peoples was sometimes destroyed, but individually, even in the worst cases, they were usually reduced to servitude rather than put to the sword. Cases like that of Saguntum and of Numantia, or like the taking of Tyre by Alexander the Great, or of Carthage by Scipio, have been at all periods of history altogether exceptional. The Assyrians in the ancient East and the Mongols in the Middle Ages were the peoples most given to the practice of systematically butchering the peoples they conquered. But even they used the practice rather as a means of frightening enemies into surrender than as an end in itself, and it cannot be said that a single people was ever exterminated root and branch by their frightful slaughters. As instances of complete destruction of peoples by conquerors, the cases of the Tasmanians, the Australians and the American Indians are commonly mentioned. But actually those were primitive tribes with small populations scattered over large territories. They perished, or are perishing, chiefly because, as we have seen, agriculture and an encroaching civilization have reduced the supply of big game which was their principal means of subsistence. In a few regions where the Indians have been able to adapt themselves to a crude sort of agriculture, they have escaped destruction. In Mexico and Peru the natives were numerous at the time of the Spanish conquest because they had reached the agricultural stage. In spite of the slaughters committed by their Spanish conquerors, they today form the great majority in Spanish-American populations. In Algeria, too, a hard and bloody conquest by the French has not reduced the numerical strength of the natives. If we consider, rather, the inner ferment that goes on within the body of every society, we see at once that the struggle for preeminence is far more conspicuous there than the struggle for existence. Competition between individuals of every social unit is focused upon higher position, wealth, authority, control of the means and instruments that enable a person to direct many human activities, many human wills, as he sees fit. The losers, who are of course the majority in that sort of struggle, are not devoured, destroyed or even kept from reproducing their kind, as is basically characteristic of the struggle for life. They merely enjoy fewer material satisfactions and, especially, less freedom and independence. On the whole, indeed, in civilized societies, far from being gradually eliminated by a process of natural selection so-called, the lower classes are more prolific than the higher, and even in the lower classes every individual in the long run gets a loaf of bread and a mate, though the bread be more or less dark and hard-earned and the mate more or less unattractive or undesirable. The polygamy that is common in upper classes is the only point that might be cited in support of the principle of natural selection as applied to primitive and civilized societies. But even that argument is weak. Among human beings, polygamy does not necessarily imply greater fertility. In fact, the preferably polygamous human societies have been the ones that have made least social progress. It would seem to follow, therefore, that natural selection has proved to be least effective in the cases where it is at freest play. 14. Then again, if the progress of a race or a nation depends primarily on organic improvement in the individuals who compose it, the world's story should present a far different plot from the one we know. The moral and intellectual, and therefore the social, progress of every people should be slower and more continuous. The law of natural selection combined with the law of heredity should carry each generation a step, but only a step, ahead of the preceding generation, and we should not, as is frequently the case in history, see a people take a great many steps forward, or sometimes a great many steps backward, in the course of 2 or 3 generations. Examples of such rapid advances and giddy declines are so common as scarcely to require mention. A mere 120 years intervened between the day of Pisistratus and the day of Socrates, but during those years Hellenic art, Hellenic thought, Hellenic civilization made such measureless progress as to transform a nation of mediocre though ancient civilization into the Greece which traced the most glamorous, the most profound, the most unforgettable pages in the story of human progress. We do not mention the case of Rome because, to tell the truth, Hellenic influence played a large part in her meteoric passage from barbarism to civilization. The Italy of the Renaissance is chronologically only a little over a century removed from the Italy of Dante, but in that interval the artistic, moral and scientific ideal is transformed by an inner creative ferment of the nation and the man of the Middle Ages changes and is gone. Compare, for a moment, the France of 1650, the France of 1750. Still alive in the former are men who can remember St. Bartholomew's Eve. The religious wars, the Holy League, the falling of 2 kings under the assassin's dagger, are facts which have not yet acquired the mystery of ancientness, eyewitnesses of them cannot be rare. Anyone who has passed early youth may easily have been present at the taking of La Rochelle, the closing scene in the historic period referred to. Almost no one dares voice a doubt as to the existence of goblins and witches. A scant 37 years have passed since the wife of Marshal d'Ancre was burned at the stake as a witch. A century later, Montesquieu is an old man, Voltaire and Rousseau are in their prime, the encyclopedia, if not published, has already ripened in the intellectual world. As far as ideas, beliefs, customs, are concerned, the revolution of '89 may be considered virtually complete. But without wandering far afield for other examples, why not take the chief countries of present-day Europe, England, Germany, Italy, Spain? Certainly if the intellectual and spiritual revolution that has taken place in those countries in the course of the past century had had to depend on organic modifications in their populations, many dozens of generations at least would have been required. In certain regions, which for special causes had lagged behind the general trend in Europe, the transformation has been more rapid and, especially, more profound. Anyone superficially familiar with the histories of Scotland and Sicily can make a ready comparison between social conditions in Scotland in 1748 and the status that country had attained in 1848, and between social conditions in Sicily in 1812 and conditions there today. On the other hand, examples of swift declines in nations or whole civilizations are far from rare. There is a very general inclination to charge these to destructive barbarian invasions, but this is to forget that before a civilized country can fall prey to barbarians it must have lapsed into a state of great exhaustion and disorganization, which in turn must be due to moral and political decay. Greater civilization almost always presupposes greater population and the possession of more potent and effective resources for offense and defense. China has twice been conquered by Mongols or Tatars, and India a number of times by Turks, Tatars, and Afghans. But the Chinese and Hindu civilizations had already entered upon periods of decline at the time of such invasions. That decline in civilized peoples is in certain cases spontaneous can be almost mathematically proved. All Orientalists know that the most ancient of all the Egyptian civilizations, the one that built the Nile canals, invented hieroglyphic writing and reared the Great Pyramids, fell to pieces of its own accord and vanished so completely that so far no one has been able to learn why. There were civil wars, that is all we know. Then came darkness and barbarism, from which, more than 4 centuries later, a new civilization just as spontaneously emerged. Says Lenormand. Beginning with the civil disturbances in which Nittigrit lost his life, Egyptian civilization enters upon a sudden eclipse that has so far remained unexplainable. Manetho counts 436 years between the end of the 6th dynasty and the beginning of the 11th. During that period the monuments are absolutely silent. It is as though Egypt had been stricken from the roster of nations, and when civilization reappears at the end of the long slumber it seems to begin without any tradition from the past. As a matter of fact, Lenormand does not deny that foreign invasions may have occurred during the period in question, but, in any event, over and above the fact that there is no trace of them in monuments and inscriptions, it is certain that they must have followed, not preceded, the decline of the earlier Egyptian civilization. Babylonia, for many centuries a center of civilization, was not destroyed by its conquerors, not by Cyrus, not by Darius, not by Alexander. It collapsed and disappeared from the world scene by slow decay, by automatic dissolution. The Roman Empire in the West is said to have been destroyed by barbarians. But anyone even moderately familiar with Roman history knows that the barbarians killed a mere corpse, that the decline in art, literature, wealth, public administration, in short, in all phases of Roman civilization, had been tremendous between the days of Marcus Aurelius and the days of Diocletian. During this period the barbarians made temporary raids into a few provinces, to be sure, but they gained a foothold nowhere within the empire and wrought no lasting harm. A great invasion by the Goths occurred under the Emperor Decius and was finally repulsed by Claudius II. It was, however, exceptional. It laid waste the eastern provinces of the empire, but Greco-Roman civilization was to survive for many, many centuries in those very districts. Without disturbances from any foreign invasion or other external forces, the Spain of the second half of the 17th century became a mere shadow of the country that a century earlier had been the Spain of Charles V, and half a century earlier had had a Cervantes, a Lope de Vega and a Quevedo. This rapid decline of the Iberian Peninsula has been blamed on the expulsion of the Moors, which occurred for the most part in 1609, under Philip III. But the expulsion of the Moors injured only a few provinces, notably parts of Valencia and Andalusia, and these were the regions that suffered least in the general impoverishment of Spain. Portugal and Italy declined simultaneously with Spain, though to a less appreciable extent. Certainly they were not suffering from any expulsion of Moors. The theory of organic and superorganic evolution with natural selection explains all such facts very badly, or rather not at all. Keeping to that theory, a more highly civilized people should be progressively purified and improved by the struggle for existence and should through heredity acquire over others an advantage, which, so far as one can see, it should not lose in the race of the nations across the centuries. What we see, instead, is a nation, or a group of peoples, now leaping forward with irresistible impetus, then collapsing or lagging wretchedly behind. One may note, to be sure, a certain progressive movement which, in spite of interruptions and gaps, thrusts mankind farther and farther forward, and the present civilization of the Aryan race is in fact superior to all preceding civilizations. But we must bear in mind that every new people that has the good fortune to become civilized has a shorter road to travel and expends infinitely less effort, because it inherits the experience and the positive knowledge of all the civilizations that have preceded it. Certainly the Germans of Tacitus would never have succeeded in so few as 18 centuries in forming such centers of culture as London, Berlin and New York if they had to discover by themselves alphabetic writing, the fundamental principles of mathematics and all the immense store of knowledge that they gained from contact with the Greeks and Romans. Nor would Hellenic and Roman civilizations have made the progress they made without infiltrations from ancient Near Eastern civilizations, to which they in fact owed the alphabet and the rudiments of the exact sciences. Human civilization progresses by scientific rather than by organic inheritance. The descendants of a civilized people may stagnate or may even relapse into barbarism, but the learning of their fathers may fertilize the nascent civilization of uncouth hordes that happen to find themselves favorably placed for receiving such beneficent germs. The modern Anglo-Saxons are not descendants of the Romans or the Greeks, or of the Semites of Syria among whom the religion that has left so deep an imprint on the people of Great Britain and its colonies originated. They are not descendants of the Arabs to whom the world owes much of the physical and mathematical knowledge which the English and Americans of modern times have so wondrously applied and made productive. What they have inherited is not the blood but the scientific and psychological achievements of the peoples mentioned. At times a people rising anew to civilization may avail itself of the intellectual and spiritual activity of ancestors who have regressed from civilization after once attaining it. That was the case with the ancient Egyptians and with the Italians of the Renaissance, but that very fact, if we choose to scrutinize it carefully, furnishes one more argument against the theory that social progress depends on organic heredity. Even the evolutionists recognize that other races attained civilization earlier than the Aryan race and earlier than the Germanic branch of that race in particular, but they add that those races declined or became stationary because they had aged, in other words, because they had exhausted all the intellectual and moral resources at their command. Really, this idea of the aging of races seems to us the product of a wholly specious analogy between the life of an individual and the life of a community. But, to keep to the facts as we see them, for the very reason that the members of a community continuously reproduce themselves and each new generation has all the vigor of youth, a whole society can hardly grow old in the same sense in which an individual grows old when his powers begin to fail. So far as we know, furthermore, no organic difference has ever been found between the individuals in a progressing society and the individuals in a declining society. Societies in decline grow old because of changes in their type of social structure. At such times religious beliefs, customs, prejudices, the traditions on which political and social institutions are grounded, grow old, or rather are gradually discredited. But these are all social elements, the changes in which come about through the interposition of new historical factors with which a people chances to come into contact, or even through a slow and automatic intellectual, moral and social evolution within the people itself. It is hazardous, therefore, very hazardous indeed, to assert that changes in the physical constitution of a race play any part in such things. It would be difficult to show that the brains of the Frenchmen of Voltaire's day were differently constituted from the brains of their great-grandfathers who committed the massacre of St. Bartholomew and organized the League. It is very easy to show, on the other hand, that in a little over a century and a half the economic and political situation in France, and her intellectual atmosphere, had altered radically. The belief that all non-Aryan civilizations, the Egyptian, the Babylonian, the ancient and modern Chinese, have been, and still are, uniformly stationary seems to us to be due to nothing less than an optical illusion arising from the fact that we view them from so far away. So it is with the mountains of Sicily, which, viewed from afar off under that limpid, transparent sky, look like lovely azure walls closing the horizon with a uniform perpendicularity, but which from close at hand look altogether otherwise, since each comprises its own particular little world of ascents, descents and irregularities of every kind. Chaldean and Egyptian monuments have shown with a positiveness that can no longer be questioned that there were ups and downs, periods of decline and periods of renaissance and progress in goodly number both on the banks of the Nile and on the banks of the Euphrates and the Tigris. As for China, its civilization has, to be sure, endured amazingly and without interruption for some thousands of years, but that is not saying that it was always the same. We know enough of Chinese history to be certain that the political and social organization of the Celestial Empire has undergone tremendous changes in the course of the centuries. China had her feudal period and, at least until very recently, she was ruled by a bureaucracy recruited by competitive examinations. Religion and property ownership have also undergone most varied vicissitudes in China. 15. In his Evolution de la Morale, Letourneau attributes progress in human societies to an organic process whereby a good action, which would be a useful action, leaves its mark on the brain and nerve centers of the individual who performs it. That mark, repeated over and over again, produces a tendency to reiterate the same act, and the tendency is in turn transmitted to the individual's descendants. In the first place, one might ask why bad, in other words, harmful, actions should not leave similar marks, and in the second place, as regards useful acts, one might ask, useful to whom? To the individual who performs them or to society? The two utilities are only two separate and distinct, and it would seem necessary to have had very little experience of the world to maintain that an action that is useful to society is generally useful to the individual who performs it, and vice versa. But suppose we let Letourneau speak for himself. Just as phosphorescent bodies remember light, so the nerve cell remembers its intimate acts, but in ways that are infinitely more varied and persistent. Every act that has been performed at the instance of a nerve cell leaves on the cell a sort of functional residue that thenceforward will facilitate repetitions of the act and sometimes provoke it. Such reiteration, in fact, will become easier and easier and in the end will take place spontaneously, automatically. By that time the nerve cell has acquired an inclination, a habit, an instinct, a need. And again he says, nerve cells are essentially impregnation mechanisms. Every current of molecular activity that runs through them leaves a more or less revivescent trace upon them. By sufficient repetition these traces become organic, fixed, and are even transmitted by heredity, and each of them has a corresponding tendency, a corresponding inclination, which will manifest itself in due time and contribute to the formation of what is called character. This general picture must be held in view if one would have any comprehension of the origin and evolution of morality. Further pursuing the same idea he adds, in their essential aspects ethics are utilitarian and progressive. However, once they have been formed, once they have been established in the nerve centers, moral or immoral inclinations fade as slowly as they have been clothed with flesh. Often also they reappear atavistically, and in such cases one suddenly sees moral specimens from the Stone Age rising in the full midst of a relatively civilized society, or heroic types in the flower of a mercantile civilization. These quotations should suffice to give a fairly accurate idea of the writer's basic conception. They will further suffice to give a fairly clear idea of the arguments of the whole school that bases its sociology on the anthropological sciences. But however attractive, however daring, hypotheses may be, they are of value in science only when they are supported by experience, in other words, by demonstrations based on fact. We have no intention of discussing here the genuineness of the complicated organic process that we find set forth in Letourneau's book with such definiteness and assurance. But facts are always facts. They have the same scientific value whether they are derived from studies of nerve cells, or of the hair color and cranial measurements of this race or that, from observations of animal societies or from studies of human history. The only classification in order of importance that is permissible is a classification that distinguishes carefully ascertained facts, for example, that have not been discovered and championed by the same men who have spun theories about them, from dubious, inadequately tested facts that have been colored by the preconceptions of the observer. Now all history amply shows that the progress of human societies does not follow the course that it would follow if the theories of the anthropological school were sound. Before we can accept these theories, therefore, they at least have to be qualified. It has to be admitted that the civilized human being, or the human being capable of civilization, who is certainly no newcomer on the face of the earth, has experienced in his nerve cells so many and such varied moral impressions that he is able to adopt the most disparate tendencies and habits, both those which lead a society toward intellectual, moral and political betterment and those which carry it toward decline and ruin. 16. But so qualified, the anthropological theory has no practical value left. It does not, it cannot, tell us anything that we do not already know. It is more worth our while, therefore, to seek scientific results along some other road, however rough the going may be. The truth is that just as the study of climatic differences has never been able to supply a general law to explain the organization of human societies and the variety of type that such societies present, so too no satisfactory law has been found on the basis of racial diversities, nor is it possible to ascribe the progress or the ruin of nations to organic improvements or organic degenerations in races. Anyone who has traveled a good deal ordinarily comes to the conclusion that underneath superficial differences in customs and habits human beings are psychologically very much alike the world over, and anyone who has read history at all deeply reaches a similar conclusion with regard to the various periods of human civilization. Dipping into the documents that tell us how people of other ages felt, thought and lived, we come always to the same conclusion, that they were very much like us. Psychological resemblance is always stronger among peoples who have attained approximately similar levels of civilization than it is among peoples closer to each other chronologically and ethnically. In his manner of thinking a modern Italian or German is nearer to a Greek of the time of Plato and Aristotle than he is to a medieval ancestor of his own. The literatures of the different epochs bear the most emphatic testimony to that fact. Such psychological resemblances, and the fact that the great races which constitute 4/5 of mankind have shown themselves capable of the most varied vicissitudes of progress and decline lead us to advance a hypothesis which follows also from the negative investigations we have so far been making. We are inclined to think that just as human beings, or at least the great human races, have a constant tendency toward social grouping, so too they have equally constant and powerful psychological tendencies which impel them onward toward ever higher levels of culture and social progress. Such tendencies, however, operate with more or less vigor, or may even be stifled, according as they find physical environments, complexes of circumstances that might be called chance which are more or less favorable, and according also as they are more or less hampered by social environments, in other words by psychological tendencies equally universal and constant. That, after all, is an organic process similar to what takes place in the whole animal and vegetable world, though far more complicated. A plant has a strong tendency to spread and multiply. The tendency may be seconded or thwarted by physical environment, in other words by conditions of water supply and climate, by chance in the form of wind and birds which fertilize or scatter its seeds, and then and again by traits of the plant itself, the greater or lesser resistance it offers to diseases that attack it. And a similar process goes on in that branch of social activity which has been so generally and so successfully studied, the production of wealth. Wealth production has a tendency to increase unlimitedly, but the tendency is more or less hindered by physical obstacles. It is to an extent hindered by chance, and it is hindered, finally, by the ignorance, the consuming greed, and the mental attitudes of human beings. Man neither creates nor destroys any of the forces of nature, but he can study their manner of acting and their interplay and turn them to his advantage. That is the procedure in agriculture, in navigation, in mechanics. By following it, modern science has been able to achieve almost miraculous results in those fields of activity. The method surely cannot be different when the social sciences are involved, and in fact it is the very method that has already yielded fair results in political economy. Yet we must not disguise the fact that in the social sciences in general the difficulties to be overcome are enormously greater. Not only does the greater complexity of psychological laws, or constant tendencies, that are common to all human groups make it harder to determine their operation, but it is easier to observe the things that go on about us than it is to observe the things we ourselves do. Man can much more easily study the phenomena of physics, chemistry or botany than he can his own instincts and his own passions. One should think of the divers prejudices which, according to Spencer, impede progress in the social sciences. Certainly the student of political science has to look objectively upon nationalities, religions, political parties, political doctrines, treating them merely as phenomena of the human mind. But the precept is more easily given to others than applied by oneself. It must be confessed that the objectivity essential to the successful conduct of this type of observation will always be the privilege of the limited number of individuals who are endowed with special aptitudes and have undergone special intellectual training. But then, even granting that such individuals can attain scientific results, it is highly problematical whether they can succeed in using them to modify the political conduct of the great human societies. What happens in economics is instructive. Free trade is unanimously regarded by unprejudiced experts in that science as a good thing, yet the most highly civilized nations are today turning to the fiercest protectionism. 17. Whatever practical value political science may have in the future, progress in that field will be based upon the study of the facts of society, and those facts can be found only in the history of the various nations. In other words, if political science is to be grounded upon the observation and interpretation of the facts of political life, it is to the old historical method that we must return. To that method a number of objections, more or less serious, are being raised and we must briefly consider them. It is said, in the first place, that any number of writers, from Aristotle down to Machiavelli, Montesquieu and the scholars of our own day, have used the historical method and that, though many of their incidental observations have been universally accepted as grounded upon fact and as truths scientifically acquired, no truly scientific system has as yet been found. But what we have already said of the positive method in general may be said of the historical method in particular, that to yield good results it has to be properly applied. Now before it can be properly applied an indispensable requirement is a wide and accurate knowledge of history, and that was not within the reach of Aristotle or Machiavelli or Montesquieu, or of any other writer who lived earlier than a century ago. Great syntheses can be essayed only after a vast body of facts have been accumulated and verified by the scientific method. Historical information was of course not lacking in centuries past, but it bore almost exclusively upon isolated periods. Down to the beginning of the last century, Greco-Roman civilization and the history of the modern European nations were known perhaps after a fashion, but as for the past of the rest of the world nothing was available except the vaguest of legends and very untrustworthy traditions. Even within the limited portions of history just mentioned, such knowledge as was available was far from perfect. The critical sense was still undeveloped. There was none of that patient documentary research, of that minute and attentive interpretation of inscriptions, which has not only drawn the general lines of the acts of great historical characters more accurately and clearly but has revealed details of social custom and political and administrative organization in the different peoples which are of far greater interest to the study of political science than the personal feats of great warriors and rulers. Exact knowledge of physical geography, ethnology and comparative philology, which shed light on the origins and blood ties of nations, prehistory, which has revealed the ancientness of the human species and of certain civilizations, the interpretation of hieroglyphic, cuneiform and ancient Hindu alphabets, which has unveiled the mysteries of Oriental civilizations now extinct, all these were conquests of the 19th century. During the same century the mists that enveloped the history of China, Japan and other nations of the Far East were at least partially cleared away, and the records of ancient American civilizations were in part discovered, in part more accurately studied. Finally, during that century, comparative statistical studies first came into general use, facilitating knowledge of conditions among faraway peoples. There can be no doubt about it, where the student of the social sciences could once only guess, he now has the means to observe and the instruments and the materials to demonstrate. Aristotle had but a very imperfect knowledge of the history of the great Asiatic monarchies. His information was probably limited to what Herodotus and Xenophon had written and to what he had been able to learn from Alexander's veterans, who had little understanding of the countries they conquered. The only political type he knew was the Greek city-state of the 4th and 5th centuries before our era. He could have learned little or nothing that was accurate about the rest of the world. Under those circumstances, his politics is an extraordinary intellectual feat, and his classification of governments into monarchies, aristocracies and democracies, a classification that might now be judged superficial and incomplete, was certainly the very best that the human mind could contrive in his day. The only model for the state that Machiavelli had directly before him was the Italian commune of the late 15th century, with its alternatives of tyranny and anarchy, where power was won or lost in a game of violence and trickery, with the winnings to him who was the better liar or delivered the last dagger thrust. We can understand how such a model must so have impressed his mind as to make him write as prince. The fact that his information was confined almost exclusively to such Roman history as could be learned in his day and to the history of the great modern monarchies which had risen a little before his time explains his commentary on Livy, his histories and his letters. Montesquieu had no way of knowing the history of the Orient very much better than Aristotle, or that of Greece and Rome any more profoundly than Machiavelli. His wider knowledge of the institutions and history of France, England, and Germany, coupled with his little knowledge of other countries, explains his theory that political liberty would be possible only in cold countries. 18. Another objection is made to the historical method. If it is no sounder than the above objection, it is certainly more alluring, so much so that in the eyes of many it may seem to be very serious, if not insuperable. It relates to the scant reliability of historical materials. It is commonly alleged that, for all of their many efforts, historians often fail to discover the truth, that it is often hard to determine with any exactness just how things which have happened in our own towns within the year actually came to pass, so that it is virtually impossible to obtain accounts that are worthy of belief when faraway times and places are concerned. No one forgets to point to contradictions between the different historians, to the lie they often give each other, to the passions by which they are commonly swayed, the conclusion being that no certain inferences, no real science, can be derived from facts which are always very dubious, always very imperfectly known. It is not hard to answer such arguments. First of all, and incidentally, one might note that only when we have no interest in learning the truth, or no means of doing so, or when contrary interests are opposed to our doing so, do we fail to learn the exact truth about contemporary happenings. If no such obstacles are present, anyone who is willing to spend the time and the money required can always, by a more or less intensive inquiry, discover in the maze of varying versions, gossipings and hearsays just how a given event came to pass. As regards historical facts, the older they are the fainter becomes the clamor of the interests that aim to distort exact knowledge regarding them, and we take it for granted that the historian has patience enough and time enough to disentangle the truth concerning them. Of far greater importance is a second observation that we must make in this connection. The historical facts which are and always will be shrouded in the greatest uncertainty are anecdotal, biographical facts, facts which may involve the vanity or profit of a man, a nation, a party. It is chiefly in regard to such facts that the passions of a writer may be the cause, be it unwittingly, of error. Fortunately, that type of fact is of scant interest to the student of the political sciences. It makes little difference to him whether a battle has been won through the merit of one commander or lost through the fault of another, or whether a political assassination was more or less justifiable. On the other hand, there are facts that concern the social type and organization of the various peoples and the various epochs, and it is about such facts, which are of the greater interest to us, that historians, spontaneously and without bias, often tell the truth. At any rate, more enlightening than the historians are the documents themselves. We shall probably never know just when Homer lived, in what city he was born, what episodes marked his life. These problems may have a certain interest for the critic or the scholar, who would like to know the most minute details about the life of the author of the Iliad and the Odyssey. They are of little interest to the political scientist, who is studying the psychological and social world that the great poet describes, a world which, however much the bard's fancy may have embellished it, must actually have existed in an age but slightly anterior to his time. No one will ever know the breed of Alcibiades' dog, the color of Alexander's horse, what the exact faults and merits of Themistocles were, just how the speeches of Pericles were delivered, whether Agesilaus was lame in his right leg or his left. But it has been established beyond possibility of doubt that from the 6th to the 4th century before our era there existed in Hellas a certain type of political organization, the different varieties and peculiarities of which we already know well, and shall know even better as inscriptions and monuments that are gradually being found are studied, along with the details of its administrative, economic and military structure. No one, probably, will ever know anything exact about the life of Cheops, the Egyptian king of the 4th dynasty, in spite of the Great Pyramid that he ordered raised as his tomb. No one will ever possess the biography of Ramses II, of the 19th dynasty, though Pentuer's poem in celebration of his victories, real or imaginary, still survives. But no one will doubt that 30 or 40 centuries before our era there existed in the valley of the Nile an organized, civilized, very populous society, and that the human spirit must have made prodigious efforts of patience and originality to raise it from barbarism. No one can doubt that that society, ever changing with the revolving centuries, had religious beliefs and scientific information and, at times, an administrative and military organization so remarkable that it might almost be compared with those of the most highly civilized states of our own time. We may doubt whether Tiberius and Nero were the rascals that Tacitus said they were, and whether the feeble-mindedness of Claudius, the lasciviousness of Messalina, Caligula's passion for his horse, may not have been exaggerated. But we cannot deny that the Roman Empire existed and that its emperors had a power to commit crimes and follies which would not have been tolerated in other epochs and in other types of political organization. Nor can we doubt that in the early centuries of our era a great civilization, embodied politically in a great state, embraced the whole Mediterranean basin. We already know well, and shall know better and better, the legislation and the highly perfected financial, administrative and military organization of that state. We may go so far as to assume that Sakyamuni was wholly a myth, that Jesus was never crucified or even that he never existed. But no one will ever deny the existence of Buddhism and Christianity, along with the dogmas and moral precepts on which they were founded, nor will anyone ever deny that since those two religions have spread abroad so widely and have so long endured they must satisfy emotions and psychological needs that are widely prevalent in the human masses. 19. In conclusion, then, while the anecdote and the biographical detail may have had their influence on the history of nations, they can be of little help in discovering the great psychological laws that are manifested in the lives of the nations. Such laws reveal their operation, rather, in administrative and judicial institutions, in religions, in all the moral and political customs of the various nations, and it is therefore upon these last categories of facts that we must concentrate our attention. With regard to such facts, it seems to us difficult and scarcely worth our while to establish very rigid standards of preference. Any detail of information, be it historical or contemporary, which relates to the institutions of a people that is organized politically, a people, in other words, that has consolidated in fairly populous masses and attained a certain degree of civilization, of whatever type, may be very interesting. If any recommendation may be made in the matter, it is this, that we avoid deriving all our observations from a group of political organisms that belong to the same historical period or present the same, or not widely differing, types of civilization. For example, if the only history we considered were that of the Greek states in the age of Pericles, we might be led to believe that the history of the world comes down to a struggle between Hellenism and barbarism, or between democracy and aristocracy, or better, between two oligarchies, the one of a more limited, the other of a more inclusive membership. If we thought only of Europe between the year 1500 and the year 1600, we might conclude that the whole movement of humanity during that period came down to a conflict between Catholicism and Protestantism, or between European and Mohammedan civilizations. In his first principles, Spencer tried to forearm students of the social sciences against what he called perversions of judgment or bias, against certain habits of the human mind whereby the observer views the facts of society from a subjective, one-sided and limited point of view that is inevitably productive of erroneous results. Now, to eliminate that pitfall, it is not enough to warn anyone likely to fall into it that the pitfall exists. His mind has to be trained in such a way as to avoid it. Awareness of political prejudice, national prejudice, religious or anti-religious prejudice, does not prevent an individual, when he comes to a practical application of the Spencerian theories, from falling into one or more such prejudices if he has been reared in the belief that the adoption of a given form of government is enough to regenerate mankind, that his nation is the first in the universe, that his religion is the only true one, or that human progress consists in destroying all religion. The real safeguard against that type of error lies in knowing how to lift one's judgment above the beliefs and opinions which are current in one's time or peculiar to the social or national type to which one belongs. That, to go back to a point on which we have already touched, comes with the study of many social facts, with a broad and thorough knowledge of history, not, certainly, of the history of a single period or a single nation but, so far as we possibly can, the history of mankind as a whole. 20. In our day there prevails, or at least down to a very recent day there prevailed, in social research a tendency to give special attention to the simpler and more primitive political organizations. Some scholars go as far back as possible and scrupulously analyze animal societies, tracking down in beehives, anthills and the lairs of quadrupeds and quadrumanes the earliest origins of the social sentiments that find their complete expression in the great political organisms of men. The majority keep to the organizations of savage tribes, and all circumstances relating to such peoples are noted and recorded. The narratives of travelers who have lived among savages have so acquired special importance, and quotations from them fill modern volumes on sociology. We do not say that such studies are useless. It is hard to find any application of the human intelligence that is completely unfruitful. But certainly they do not seem the best adapted to furnishing sound materials for the social sciences in general and for political science in particular. First of all, the narratives of travelers are as a rule more subjective, more contradictory, less trustworthy than the accounts of historians, and they are less subject to checking by documents and monuments. An individual who finds himself among people who belong to a very different civilization from the one to which he is accustomed generally views them from certain special points of view, and so may readily be misled. Herodotus was the greatest traveler of antiquity, and, as checking has now proved, he was a conscientious and far from superficial observer. Nevertheless, he reported many things incorrectly, for the sole reason that he was steeped in a Greek civilization and so was poorly equipped to interpret certain phenomena of Near Eastern civilization. If one could check the reports of modern travelers on authentic documents, as has occasionally been possible in the case of Herodotus, we do not believe that they would prove to be any more exact. If one is looking for light on the real social conditions of a given people, an authentic document such as the Laws of Manu, the fragments of the 12 Tables or the Code of Rothari is worth much more than the reports of any number of modern travelers. We understand, however, that a traveler's account may prove very useful in providing illustration and comment for such documents. In the case of primitive peoples, of course, no documents whatever are available. In the second place, social facts can be gathered only in a human society, and by society we mean not a small group of a few families but what is commonly called a nation, a people, a state. Psychological social forces cannot develop, and cannot find scope, except in large political organisms, in aggregates, that is, where numerous groups of human beings are brought together in a moral and political union. In the primitive group, in the tribe of 50 or 100 individuals, the political problem hardly exists, and therefore cannot be studied. Monarchy, for example, is easy enough to understand in a small tribe where the strongest and craftiest male readily imposes his will on a handful of comrades. But we must be in possession of very different elements before we can account for the establishment of such an institution in a society of millions of individuals, where a single man alone cannot force himself by physical strength upon all the others combined, and where, however crafty and energetic a man may be, he will readily find in the masses about him hundreds of individuals who, at least potentially, are as talented and resourceful as he. So again we can easily see how a few dozen or even a few hundred individuals living together, and holding apart in moral if not material isolation from the rest of the world, should come to present a definite oneness of mental type and to have a lively sense of tribe and family. Hot to understand that is of little help when we come to explaining why a single moral type, an intense national feeling, should exist in human aggregations of tens and sometimes, as in the case of Russia and China, of hundreds of millions of persons, where individuals pass their whole lives far removed from most of their fellows, are for the most part cut off from any personal intercourse with them, and in their various groups face widely differing conditions of material living. The study of minute political units is said to be useful because they show in embryo all the social organs that gradually develop in larger and more advanced societies, and it is supposed to be much easier to study the manner of working of such organs when they are in their rudimentary forms than when they have grown more complex. But the comparing, now so frequent, of the organization of human societies with organizations of individual animal societies has never seemed to us less apt and less instructive than in this instance. It can easily be turned against the thesis in favor of which it was invoked. We do not believe that any zoologist would try to solve problems of anatomy and physiology in the warm-blooded vertebrates by studying the lower animals. It was not, certainly, from the observation of amoebas and polyps that the circulation of the blood was discovered and then that the functions of the heart, brain and lungs in man and the other higher animals were finally determined.